The Pontiac Aztek has become the go-to car when describing ugly cars. And sure, it's got a short, awkward, hatchbacky sort of style that has become popular lately in SUVs. And it had that funky plastic two-tone that's considered butch on things like Subarus and Audis. And of course, there was that pseudo hood scoop double-decker front end that sort of reminded people of a sportier family truckster. But today, I'm going to show you 3 classic American cars that may make you reconsider how ugly the Pontiac Aztek is. Now, of course, classic car can be a relative term, but we're going to start in the mid-1970s. Now, the 1970s isn't known for cars with great looks, but today we're going to pick on AMC. AMC had a lot of quirky cars in the 1970s. Probably the least quirky of them all was the Hornet, although its overly conservative styling in the early 70s was considered European. Then, of course, there was the Gremlin, which was basically a Hornet that appeared to have been shortened with a samurai sword. And although it was the first American car with what would become the traditional hatchback look, a hatchback was actually an option on these cars. Then, of course, you had the Eagle, which was also a Hornet, but slapped on top of Jeep running gear. Unless, of course, it was the SX4, and then it was a Spirit body slapped on top of a Jeep. And who can forget the AMC Pacer, whose styling was described as a goldfish bowl. Even the sporty Javelin had that odd double fender thing that seemed to be the inspiration for most modern Mazdas. But the car we're looking at is the mid-70s Matador. Not the streamlined Matador Coupe, although that has a lot of quirky aspects of its own and could hardly be considered typical styling of the period. We're going to pick on the more generic sedan version. Now, stylistically, the coupe and the sedan had virtually nothing in common. No streamlining attempts were made from the sedan. In fact, in profile, it's very stodgy looking. And although from the back, both cars could be considered a bit awkward stylistically, the sedan had a sort of homemade custom look to it. And although these two features would make this car seem a bit homely, the big problem was the front end, basically a caricature of the popular styling of the time. Even when updated to the quad square headlights, it didn't help the front end of this car. And when it had the regular single round headlights, the protruding grille was enough to make you think the car would actually bark at you. For our second car, we're going to go back to the early 60s, specifically the early 60s Chryslers. The shortened early 60s models were even described by Virgil Exner as plucked chickens. And although this was the designer that gave us the forward-look cars, he's also the designer that gave us Imperials with freestanding headlights and George Jetson taillights. But in spite of all this, the car that stands out are the 1961 Plymouth Standards, the Savoy Belvedere Fury. Now, in two-door hardtop form, from certain angles, these cars could seem downright sleek, and the convertible, from the rear at least, almost looked like classic speedboats. But your basic four-door sedan didn't have anything that resembled sleek, and the rear of these cars were so Spartan that they almost seemed unfinished. In fact, if you take the rear lights off of this car, it doesn't really change the back-end styling at all. But again, the real problem was the front of the car. In fact, it's almost like they designed it as the rear of the car, couldn't come up with a front, and just swapped it around to the front. It even has what appear to be backwards gull wing fins. And the grille itself doesn't even look like it really belongs there. And for our third car, we're going to go back just a few more years to the last of the Hudsons. Now, the late 40s redesign that carried into the early 50s actually seemed to look heavier as it progressed through the years. And even though the styling wouldn't be what you would consider typical for the period, it wasn't particularly unattractive. But after the Nash-Hudson merger of '54, Hudson's moved to the Nash body in 1955, a styling that was not only more controversial, but had been struggling to break its upside-down bathtub reputation for styling. And arguably, the 55 model, although more conservative, was better looking than the Nash's, but apparently they couldn't have that. So they added some awkward-looking bolt-on fins, some peculiar 3 and 4 tone trim, even some odd-looking double backwards bolt-on fins to the front fenders, and topped it all off with a grille so big that it wouldn't look out of place on a modern heavy-duty pickup. And what you ended up with was a car that even in its best versions looked awkward, if not downright peculiar. Although, taking into what passes for style today, I'd rather have any one of these cars. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.